Hello, everybody, and welcome to Todd and Shane's Cloudy Podcast, episode 445, recorded live November 20th, 2019. As you can tell, there is more Todd and less Shane, and everybody loves that, so I'm glad to have you all here today. I have not been able to do the podcast for a couple of weeks. I was in Slovenia, I was in Orlando, I was all over the world, and by all over the world, I mean in two places. And Shane was busy today. He's off saving the world and fighting fires and doing all kinds of stuff in Power Apps. But I missed you guys, and I had so much to talk about. I've got this whole OneNote full of things that I wanted to talk to you guys about. So I'm like, I'm just doing it without him. Lori is even on vacation. It is just one man and a microphone. I would say that I have two turntables and a microphone, but I really don't even have two turntables. So I just have this mic. But I've got the folks in the chat room, and I've got you folks listening to it later. So let's go ahead and do this thing. It'll be a good time, I promise. And as always, if you're listening to the audio of this, I've got a ton of things that I'm going to link in this episode. You can always go to toddclint.com/podcast445, and that will have all the show notes, the things that I talk about, the links to that. So every episode I put that out there. You can grab the links that I talk about. So before we go any further, I want to talk about the folks at SysKit. Now that you've got a full screen of me, for those of you that are unfortunate enough to get the video edition, you can see I have not one, but two poorly hung SysKit signs. This is important for two reasons. Number one, today SysKit announced a new product, SysKit Point. Again, this is another one of those links that's going to be in the show notes. And SysKit Link is a governance product, which doesn't sound sexy. Honestly, the word governance kind of puts me to sleep, kind of boring. But this product is a really great product. So I've had the fortune to be able to work with them on this product over the last few months. And this is a great product for keeping track of users and content inside of Office 365. There are so many great things about it. They've got the blog post here. Go read that. Go get a demo. But a couple of things that have really rung true for me on this particular product is that end users can use it. Site collection admins can use it. So now it's not just the tools that tenant admins have in Office 365 and the reports that they can run and all that, but end users can now run it. So if I'm a site collection owner, I can go to the SysKit Point web portal and run the tool on the site collections that I have access to. And without bothering IT and without waiting for reports to come out and all that, I can see who has access to my information, what files are shared externally, all that good information. And it's more empowering of the users. Auditors, it's easy to give an auditor access. The other thing they do is they keep the audit logs longer than 90 days, which is what Office 365 does by default. So you can look back and get more historical things. They're just like I sat with Frane. So Frane, one of the founders of SysKit, was in Slovenia with me last week in Ljubljana. And again, I've been talking to him about the product for a while. I knew it was coming, had helped him with it. And Frane's like, well, we're gonna announce next week. I want to show you a couple things. It'll only take like 15 minutes. And we fire up SysKit Point, and like an hour later, we're still going through it, and it's a lot of fun. They've just packed every single thing in. I'm a big fan. So if you can go to syskit.com, you will see their blog post. Look for Point. You can get a demo of Point. You can have them walk you through it. You can get trial versions, all that. So big fan of that. Also, the folks at SysKit tomorrow on November 21st, not sure if this podcast will be out by then or not, I'm doing a free webinar with them on offboarding. So what to do, best practices for when somebody leaves your company. And I will make sure that my signs are all hung correctly by then also, because that would be very embarrassing if they were not. So thanks again to the folks at SysKit for this great product. You can also, if you go to my blog at toddclint.com, on the right-hand side of the page, there's a link there. You can click to SysKit stuff. So thanks to them. Speaking of podcast production, got all caught up. 444 is still in the hopper because I tried a new version of Camtasia and struggled with that a little bit. So I think I'm going to have to do 444 with the old version of Camtasia, and I just have not gotten around to it because I've been traveling, been in Orlando, all that kind of stuff. But we are only one behind, and hopefully I'll be able to fix that pretty quickly. On to the topics, the meat, the potatoes that you all came to this podcast for. Speaking of meat and potatoes, I had a great time in Slovenia last week. I was at the Thrive conference. You can go to thriveconf.com to find out more about that. Have been to this conference, I think 4 or 5 years now. Love it. Go every year. Get very excited when Branka sends out the email. She's the one that coordinates this, get to go back to Slovenia. The meat and potatoes reference is that I have a fairly pedestrian palate. I don't really get, don't get fancy food, don't enjoy fancy food. And in Slovenia, they eat a lot of meat and a lot of potatoes, and I eat like a king there. It is awesome. So I mean, one of a million things to love about Slovenia. The food catering to somebody like myself is one of the many things that I love. But got to spend a few days there. We were outside of Ljubljana in a town whose Postojna, I believe, is the name of the town. A couple of cool things in Postojna. There's a big cave there. The conference center is built into the cave, and the hotel that we stayed in is kind of built into the cave in the side of the mountain. It is super cool for a guy who's lived his entire life in Iowa, where there is no elevation changes, there's no mountains or anything. That kind of stuff is always fun. So got to spend some time there. So many friends. I've gone to this conference enough now that I recognize attendees, and I see people that I've seen at previous conferences and get to catch up on them and find out what they're doing. I love doing that kind of stuff, and had several people reach out to me and, they recognize me and get caught up. Love doing that kind of stuff. Had a great time. Got to do several sessions, did one on Azure AD, did one on Office 365 groups, did one on Office 365 site scripts and site designs with Mark, and just had a blast. So really love that. If you're in Europe and you're looking for a good boutique, a smaller conference where you can be very intimate and talk to the speakers and talk to other people and not feel overwhelmed, the Thrive Conference is great. I don't know if they've announced when it will be in 2020, but go to thriveconf.com and get up to speed on that. The week before that was Ignite in Orlando. I went to half of Ignite. I was there Sunday through Wednesday. Also a great time. Got to meet up with so many friends, get caught up, friends, former coworkers, all that stuff. Loved it. Don't have a lot of time to talk about all of the things they announced at Ignite because there was a ton of them. But I do kind of for the rest of this podcast want to talk about some of the things that they announced because Microsoft definitely keeps things, they try to release them at these big cycles. So there will be a bunch of those things. Again, this list is by no means comprehensive because there's so much going on, but just the things that I got into my notes. The first thing that I wanted to talk about was the self-service subscription that Microsoft announced for Power Apps and Flow. Flow is now known as Power Automate, and Power Apps is now known as Power Space Apps. A few little adjustments that they announced at Ignite. But a month or two ago, I forget when it was, Microsoft announced that users in a tenant would be able to pay for Power Apps and Power Automate with their own credit card or with a credit card that is not billed to the tenant. And tenant admins worldwide screamed into their monitors and pulled their hair out en masse. Microsoft has got some notes on this, and I think just as of yesterday or the day before, I started seeing some blog posts on how tenant admins can use PowerShell to disable that option. So that is an evolving thing. If you're concerned about your users doing this, go read up on that. I've got one link in the show notes, and again, there's some PowerShell out there that will disable that. This is one of the lines that Microsoft is trying to walk, this tightrope line. They want people to use their products. They want people to pay for their products, but they needed to handle the governance a little better. And they swung and they missed the first time. I think this being able to shut it off at the tenant level is a good thing. My first thought on that was that it probably wasn't a bad thing if users were, so Flow and Power Automate and Power Apps don't let users get to anything or do anything that they wouldn't otherwise be able to do. The concern with Power Automate and Power Automate is that it allows you to take data on-prem and copy it to Dropbox or any of the terrible thing. You can, but you could already do that, so it doesn't open up any security holes. Now, what it does do is it makes it easier to do it in mass. That's a legitimate concern. But on the surface, my thought was this isn't a horrible idea because then, users can pay for things if they want to do it without IT having to worry about it. But then a couple of people that I talked to about it said, yeah, that's true, but some people have corporate credit cards, and so they're going to end up using corporate money anyway to pay for this with a corporate card, and it makes it impossible for IT to budget it. And yeah, so I like the fact that option is out there and that Microsoft has tightened it down. But that's something we're going to keep an eye on. And again, this is another great example of Microsoft listening to feedback. Microsoft 10 years ago, 20 years ago, would not have changed course on things like this, but Microsoft absolutely listens to feedback, listens to user voice, all these things. And if they get feedback, they evaluate it, they look at it, and they changed course. And so that's a good sign. And this is one of those things. So keep an eye on that. That space is constantly changing. But if you're an Office 365 tenant admin and you want to make sure you understand what's going on with Power Apps and Power Automate, that's one of the things you're going to want to sneak up on or keep an eye on. One of my favorite announcements, and I don't remember if this came out of Ignite or if this was an Ignite adjacent post, was about OneNote. So a while back, Microsoft said that there would not be a new version of the OneNote desktop app, that OneNote 2016 would be the last version, that it was being deprecated, and everybody was being forced to switch to the Universal Windows app, the UWP or whatever OneNote app. Now, for the most part, I'm good with change when it comes to these kind of things. I do use OneNote constantly. Every day of my professional life, I have an instance of OneNote on every monitor that I work on. Right now, there are 2 instances of it up. I've got it everywhere. I love OneNote. And so I tried to look at the UWP OneNote, and it just didn't work for me. There's layouts that were, the layout was not what I was comfortable with. Everything's on the left as opposed to some of it being on the right and on the top. And there were features that were missing in it, and a couple of them are features that I use. There's some meeting organization features that I use all the time. It just wasn't there, and it wasn't going to get there. But Microsoft was going to kill 2016, and that made me very sad. But then this last week or two, I forget again if it was Ignite or before that, they changed course on that as well, and they said, just fooling, everybody is still only using OneNote 2016, and so they're not going to deprecate it. They are going to extend its mainstream support. They're going to add some of the modern code into it, and just as a show of good faith, they added the nighttime mode, the dark mode. So I'm really glad about that. I tried the UWP OneNote. It just didn't work. I'm not a hater. I mean, I've switched a lot of stuff, but this was one that just wasn't going to work. And I'm glad they're going to stick with the 2016. Now, I don't know how many of the new features are going to show up in there, but I'm glad that they changed course on that. So I guess my thing with you, my request is Microsoft really looks at telemetry and usage and all that. So if you prefer OneNote 2016, use it, leave it up, fire it up every day. Don't fire up the bad OneNote, and give them that feedback, because those are the kind of numbers that they look at. I kind of already mentioned the next thing. Microsoft kind of slow rolled this one, was kind of quiet about it, but the product formerly known as Flow is now known as Power Automate. They're really embracing this whole Power Platform idea. So now we have Power Automate and Power Apps. I assume at some point PowerPoint and PowerShell will get sucked into the Power Platform as well. But that is a thing. So when you see references to Power Automate, it is the product previously known as Flow. The objects you create in Power Automate are still referred to as flows for maximum confusion. Everybody's still going to call it Flow, but if you see references to Power Automate in your head, make the translation. That is Flow. One other thing that they announced at Ignite was that OneDrive, the OneDrive Sync client, now supports files up to 100 gigabyte. The previous limit was something like 15 gig. I know that sounds ridiculous. Who in their right mind is being limited, is being stifled by only being able to sync up 15 gig files? I was one of those guys. I have a couple of instances where I have files that are like database backups, things like that, that I use, that I still use Dropbox for to sync, because it's the only way to get it off the remote server, get it up into the cloud, and then I pull it out of the cloud and put it someplace else. I don't leave my backups in Dropbox, but that's the easiest way, the most bandwidth efficient way to do it. And it's the only thing that I use Dropbox for. So now that OneDrive supports that up to 100 gig, that gives me plenty of room. Great that they've added that functionality. They also added a bunch of smarts around how non-Office files are synced up, so that's really great. But again, now that these files can be synced, it's a good time for your corporate use to look at that, see how that's working, see what impacts that's going to have on your bandwidth, on your storage, those things, because that's the thing. Stacy in the chat room is mentioning it's a block level sync, or is it a block level sync? They mentioned something about that. One of the demos they did at Ignite, And by the way, all of the Ignite sessions, or the vast majority of the Ignite sessions, are all available for free on YouTube and myignite.microsoft.com or something. So you can go out and find some of these sessions. But they did mention, I don't know if it's block level specifically, but they did show syncing a gigantic image or a gigantic video or something. And the video itself was 10 gig, 20 gig, I forget. They changed one little thing and it did sync the entire file. So they're getting smarter about that as well. So functionality's there. Pay attention to it. Look at your bandwidth, those kind of things. But this is OneNote or OneDrive. So OneDrive was really a stinker for a while, and then they got together and they added a bunch of features, and OneDrive was awesome. And then they kind of sat on their laurels a little bit and rode those winds a little too far, and they kind of dipped back down again. But OneDrive is back. I'm a big fan of OneDrive, so check that out. Another big announcement that Microsoft made at Ignite is that Teams now supports private channels. I haven't used private channels a lot, but I know that this is one of the things that the Teams team has been requested of them a lot. This is the ability for people who are not site collection admins or owners of a group to spin off a private chat in Teams that the team owner can't get into, all that. So that is in there now, or it's rolling out. One of the things that happens with this is when these private channels are created, it does spin up in the background an Office 365 group, which means a SharePoint site, which means all of the resources that come from that. So as a tenant admin, be aware of that. I have not looked to see what knobs we have that we can tweak on that, or if we can shut that off, but know that that's there. Know that it's there for your own use, and then know from a governance standpoint what that means to your tenant. But private channels are in Teams now. Another fun thing, and I wish I would have known this was coming out a few months ago, Microsoft now completely supports PowerShell in Azure functions, which I know those words kind of jumbled together are kind of tough to parse. But what this means is in Azure, you can write an Azure function, which is like a reoccurring process. We'll get to that in a second. But that Azure function now doesn't have to be code, .NET code or anything. It can be PowerShell. So you can run a PowerShell script, a PowerShell module, whatever, inside of an Azure function. Now, why would you do this? Azure functions offer you a couple of things that I've taken advantage of with customers. Number one, you can trigger an Azure function with an HTTP endpoint. So something that you can trigger with a flow or any other, anything that can do an HTTP request, you can request this Azure function, pass it parameters, have it do things, and the code inside of it can be PowerShell, which is pretty slick. The thing that I've used it for, though, is PowerShell. The Azure functions can also be triggered by time. So you can say every night at 12:32, run this Azure function, which is, again, PowerShell. So for guys like me, this is a great way to automate tasks in the cloud. I don't need a machine sitting on-prem to do these things. For me, I had a customer who needed some information changed in PowerShell, specifically the user profile service. In SharePoint, specifically the user profile service. And I was running it on a machine. I had a machine that was on their network, and every night at 12:30, this batch file, this PowerShell script would run through a batch of operations, write some things to the user profile service that just there wasn't any other way to do. And obviously having a machine standing up was an inefficient way to do this. Now, as we were talking through their options, I said, well, we can fire up an Azure VM and do it in there, same kind of idea. But then what I ended up writing for them was an Azure function, and that Azure function was in PowerShell. But at the time, that was in preview. And honestly, you just never know when preview products are going to go, full support. And so I talked them into going full support, and I think that worked out well for them. And now that it's full support, I think that's going to be good. So Stacy is mentioning that you can do all this in Azure, all these things, but in Power Apps you have to pay premium. So I think it's really Power Automate, the flow piece, where the licensing is becoming a problem. The licensing model for Microsoft, they've really struggled with the Power Apps and Power Automate piece. I think what you're paying for in this instance is ease of use. You're not paying for the functionality, you're paying for how easy the functionality is to use. Having done both, having created some flows in Power Automate and having written some functionality in Azure Functions, flows are much easier, much faster to get up to speed, and that's what you're paying for. You're paying for the convenience. It's like, throughout our lives, we pay for convenience everywhere, and I think this is another example of that with the Power Automate and the PowerFlow licensing. Now, having said that, I think Microsoft's current licensing scheme for those two products is not very popular, and they need to adjust that a little bit. But I mean, that's the thing. If you can do what you need to do in an Azure Function or an Azure Logic app, and it's cheaper, you should do it. Yeah, and so Stacy brings up that one of the licenses, and I can't remember which one it is, for Power Automate and Power Apps is $40 per month per user. I've got one customer. Well, they're not really a customer, but I talked to the guy at IT, and we bounce ideas off of each other. They built their whole onboarding process around a Power App and Power Automate in the background, and have been running it for a while. And this bigger company, not huge, but big company, these licensing changes are going to add a little over $2 million a year to their licensing cost. So they're out. I mean, they can't do it. That's it. So they're already rewriting it in some other technology. So yeah, the $40 a month per person is pretty onerous. I hope they figure something else out better about that. Speaking of PowerShell, one of my biggest loves, I spend so much of my day in PowerShell. It really makes for good days, honestly. The Microsoft Graph team, and I'm not sure where he's at, if he's a product manager or program manager, just guy with fancy hair that hangs out, but a buddy of mine, Jeremy Thake, is on that team at Microsoft. They announced at Ignite that the Graph team has a PowerShell module or group of PowerShell modules that's in beta. I've had the pleasure of playing with that for a couple of months now. It's incredibly handy, and I really think that this is their fight to lose. I think the Graph has access to everything, and it's so nice to have one module or set of modules, honestly, that handles all of those pieces. And so I think if they execute this correctly, that Graph PowerShell module will be very popular and used all over. That being said, it is in beta now, and it has some rough edges. In the show notes, I'll put a link to the GitHub project where you can download it. One of my concerns is that the nouns don't have a prefix. So for instance, if you want to get an Office 365 group, right now that command is get-group. The problem is I had another PowerShell module, the ShareGate module, that has a get group command. And you have this problem where you can clobber or not clobber, and it really became a mess pretty quickly. Given who the intended audience for this PowerShell module is, admins like myself, I think that's something they're going to have to fix. And I think they're going to. I talked to Daryl a little bit about Daryl Miller is one of the lead programmers on it, and he's been really receptive and open to my ideas. So I'm really looking forward to getting this Graph PowerShell module up and going. And I think, so Jeremy reached out to me December 3rd. They've got some Graph community call or whatever. I guess I'm going to be on it and demoing some stuff. So check that out. And as I get more information about that, I'll blog that and tweet that. But if you do anything in Office 365, you owe it to yourself to download this thing and play with it a little bit, because I think it's going to be the wave of the future. So you're saying to yourself, the Graph, what is the Graph? I hear about the Graph and the giraffe and the substrate and all that. What is it? I was talking to Mark Anderson at Ignite about this a little bit, and I realized that I know what the Graph is. I feel comfortable with the Graph. I can get around the Graph. But there's that old saying that until you can explain something to a 5-year-old, you really don't understand it. And I realized that I couldn't even explain it to the 50-some-year-old that was sitting next to me, Mark. And so I really struggled with that. Again, I feel like I understand it, but yet I can't really explain it. And I was poking around on the Ignite videos, looking for stuff to do, trying to avoid actually doing work. And I stumbled across a Microsoft Garage video where Jeff Snover explains what the Graph is and what the substrate is and how it all fits together. And I really like this explanation, and I'm going to steal it. He does a great job. Jeff Snover, for you all that aren't familiar with him, he is the father of PowerShell, and he is now on the Office 365 team, and he kind of owns their AI thing. And so he builds all this in. What is the Graph? What is the substrate? How does PowerShell figure in? How does AI figure in? It's a really great video. it gave me, again, I feel like I understood it all before I watched the video, but it gave me the language and the examples on how to describe it to somebody else. So I can't just drop the phrase graph in and act like everybody knows I can do this. So great video. It's not very long. It's like 10, 12 minutes, something like that. But a pretty great video. And Jeff Snover is a great speaker. Your day is always better off if you watch something that Jeff Snover has done. Wanted to wrap up a little bit with talking about a couple of blog posts that I have done. I've been busy this summer, which is part of the reason why we didn't get so many podcasts put out. And so kind of fell away from doing the technical blogging bit. Not because I don't have blogs to write. I've got a backlog of like 10 of them, but just because I want to write them and write them well and just haven't been able to do it. Mark has been very supportive of me blogging more, and he has discovered a new tactic, which I hate him for because it is so incredibly effective. So I was working on a couple of different things and kind of bouncing them off him to make sure that I was doing them correctly and that I wasn't missing anything obvious. And he's like, oh yeah, that's a really great idea. You should blog that. And I said, well, I got this going on and this going on, and so I probably won't get around to blogging it. And his new approach to that is like, he's like, okay, well, that's great. Then I'm going to blog it. And I can't let him steal my blog material. So the last two blog posts that I've written, the first one on reversing arrays in PowerShell, and then the second one is finding missing properties in PNP PowerShell, are both things that I bounced off of him to make sure from a programming standpoint that they were a good idea. And then he told me to blog them, and I said, nah, I don't have time. And he's like, great, then I'm stealing it. And I'm like, well, amazing. I just found time to do this blog post. So one of them, again, is on reversing arrays inside of SharePoint, inside of PowerShell. And the way this happened is I was copying the left side navigation inside of a SharePoint site from one site to another. And all the pieces were there. It's like any fun engineering task. All the pieces were there. It's just putting them together in the right order. I could get all of the nav links from the source site. I could submit nav links to the destination source. But when I added the old links, the only option that I had was to add them at the top or add them at the very bottom. And the list that I had, that just none of those worked well. What I really wanted to do was take the list that I had from the old site. I wanted them all at the top. But if I start at the beginning and go to the end, then it's going to end up being reversed because everyone's going to be on top and whatever. So what I did then is I pulled the pulled the source nav link out, got it into an array, and then the array object inside of PowerShell has a reverse method. And so I took the array that was 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, reversed it 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, and then took that and walked through that array to add them to the other side. So it added 7 to the top, and then it added 6 to the top, which is now on top of 7. It added 5 to the top, which is now on top of 6 and 7, and put them in exactly the correct order. So there's a bunch of different places where this would come up, and there's a bunch of different things that I was thinking about in the past that if I'd have known how easy this was in the past, I probably would have had to write some for each loop that would have written them backwards and do whatever. But no, it's right there. It's one line, array, double colon, reverse, and then it's all good. So that one's out there. That's blog post 850, and that is reversing arrays easily in PowerShell. The other one was something I was working on. I was creating some views, automating that. I was not using site scripts and site designs for that, though that will probably be another blog post. But I was using, again, the PNP PowerShell, and I can get a view and I can set a view and I can add a view, but everything doesn't come directly across. And what I needed was a property of the old view, the query, because I was looking for the grouping settings, and that's in the query. But when I do a get PNP view, that property is not populated. Now, this is a well-known thing. I'd run across this 100 times before in the PNP, but it's the first time I talked to Mark about it, and so he's, you should blog this. So basically what happens when you do any gets with the PNP, get PNP site, get PNP list item, get PNP list, get PNP view, whatever, the PNP understands that that's all coming back in a big XML blob. And depending on how big that object set is and how wide that object set is, how many properties it is, that could be a huge ball of XML. So what the PNP does is it downloads the schema for the objects, and then it downloads a bunch of properties that it thinks are the most commonly used properties, IDs and titles and locations and things like that. But it doesn't do all of them. So that's a problem. What if that property that you need, like in my case, the query string, is one that's not not being brought down. There is a PNP command, get PNP property, that will retrieve those missing properties for you and then insert them into the objects that they're for. So what I was doing was I was going out and getting the list of views for a document library, finding the one that I wanted, grabbing that, and then going out and saying, I've got this object that is that view, go add that view query property back in. And so get PNP property, pulled that in, added in, and then I could do whatever. I could loop on it, for each on it, whatever. But that is something, the first time I stumbled across it, I can't remember what it was. I think it was get PNP file, something like that. When I tried to work with that property that was missing, I got a pretty helpful error message that said this property's not there. I was able to puzzle through it pretty easily. For get PNP view, I didn't get that feedback, but since I knew about it, I was able to puzzle through that. And Mark's very legitimate comment was, if somebody doesn't know about that, they have no idea how to get that piece of information. So I did blog that. So that is blog post 851 for finding missing properties in the PNP PowerShell. So go check those out. And like I said, I've got like 10 more in the hopper that I need to just write up and get working correctly. And then I'll add those. That pretty much covers it for the topics. One other thing, Lori is heading off on a well-deserved vacation right now, but she asked me to tell you that we're going to be doing the Lori to Todd's birthday charity drive like we do every year. That will be kicking off here in a couple of weeks. For those of you that haven't done this before, for the month roughly between Lori's birthday in December and my birthday in January, we take submissions. And if you donate to any charity, I'm not asking you to donate to a charity of my choice, though I do have some if you need some motivation. But what we're asking for is for you to think of a charity that's valuable to you and donate to them and let us know. And basically we tally all of the donations that the group has made, the podcast listeners have made over that period. We all clap for ourselves and pat each other on the back. And most years, then I match that donation to a donation of my charity. But really, the idea is to just motivate each other to think about charity. We kind of forget about it. We're all pretty charitable people. But to bring it to mind and just see the power of it. Over the years that we've done this, we have raised over $20,000. For different charities over the years. And it's something I do a lot of charitable giving and a lot of volunteering. And the way that this started, 10 years ago was that Dan Usher and Lori Gowan wanted to do something for me for my birthday. And they knew that donating and volunteering was important to me. And so they wanted to motivate people to do some of that and show me. And that was a great present. They nailed it. It was good. So we've been doing it every year. So I will have a short URL out there pretty soon where you can find information about that. Lori tallies it all up. She sends me a birthday card. The people that were involved signed the birthday card. It's a great thing. I've got the stack of them on my desk. Probably the last 5 years where the birthday cards are within arm's reach of me. I really like this. So we'll hit it again next year, but she wanted me to put the bug in your ear for that. So consider your ear appropriately bugged. Don't have any big speaking things coming up right now to talk about. Again, there's the SysKit webinar tomorrow. Check my Twitter stream and my blog on that, and we'll learn all about offboarding folks. Chat room, I'll stick around for a while. For all of you out in YouTube land and on the podcast, thanks for sticking in. Again, you can go to toddclint.com/podcast445 and get all the show notes. And I will see you next week. Shane has threatened to come by next week as well, so we'll see how that works. But we'll see you in a week. Thanks, everybody.